Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Art Alvarez with Mortgage Works, where we have the answers and they're on the house. Welcome to this week's Mortgage Minute, where we talk about all things related to the mortgage market and the bond market. And if you regularly see this program, as you know, we like to jump right into giving you a mortgage rate update, since mortgage rates are so much in the news these days. Jeff's going to pull up our rate grid. And it's funny because I've been watching and reading a lot of news stories about mortgage rates and that they're kind of trending back up again, and we're back to a 7% mortgage market. And guess what? That's not totally true, at least not with us. You can see here from our rate grid, we're right in the mid sixes, both for conforming 30-year fixed as well as the conforming buy downs. FHA, VA is down to right around the 6% range, and even jumbos are right in the low to mid sixes. So, and it was interesting because I actually provided some numbers, some worksheets for a $500,000 condo purchase scenario here in the Palm Springs area. And the person I was talking to did, share with me that he's shopping around and he's talking to mortgage bankers, mortgage brokers like us, and even large bank type lenders. And I asked him what kind of quotes he was given so far. He mentioned a large bank. He didn't give me the name, but a condo with 500,000 purchase price, 20% down, and he was told the interest rate was going to be about 7.5%, if you can believe it. And we're nowhere near that. I sent him some worksheets where I could show him we were under under 7. So again, I think rates are, as I keep saying, rates have stabilized. We're in this kind of 6% market, and I think we're going to be here for an extended period of time. Jeff's going to pull up the 10-year bond yield, and it tells more of the story. See, it's relatively stable, flat. I mean, it was a little bit elevated end of last week. This is a 5-day chart. And, as we get into this week, it was pretty stable. You see a little bit of a blip there yesterday, and that had to do with yesterday was the Fed Open Market Committee, their decision about what to do with the Fed funds rate. That made the news. And it was interesting because the Fed Chairman Powell announced that the Fed is going to pause. They're seeing, strong evidence that the economy is doing fine. Labor market's hanging in there pretty well. In fact, by the way, initial claims for unemployment benefits this week actually dropped to 207,000. So that all underscores our economy is pretty strong. But when this news came out yesterday about this Fed pause in the Fed funds rate, no, pending reduction in the Fed funds rate, initially the stock market sold off and the 10-year bond yield blipped up. Well, of course, that's an example of what I call that, the financial markets responding with reptilian-like minds to stimuli. The stimuli was the announcement that the Fed's pausing. So the initial reaction was the markets reacted negatively. But then by the end of the trading day, it started to settle down. And of course, you can see as we go into Thursday, it settled down a little bit further. The other news in terms of data points this week that I think is kind of interesting is one having to do with new homes. The inventory of new homes for sale has reached a high not seen since 2009. So while new home sales have been a relatively bright spot over the last couple of years compared to pending home sales, in December, their inventory has grown. So they're having trouble selling homes, and I think that has to do with those rates starting to head back toward the 7% barrier. So what do home builders do? They add more incentives to help get those homes sold, more incentives to the buyers to help them with their financing. Of course, a big part of that is interest rate buy downs, both permanent and temporary buy downs. So that's what I always talk about is new home builders understand that well. They do it whenever they need to get that inventory sold. The existing home market, I think, doesn't do enough of that. And we're trying as much as we can in our local market, and frankly, anywhere in California, to get more sellers of existing homes to consider that option. Case-Shiller, they came out this week with their latest numbers for home appreciation. And it was interesting, their 20-city index, these are 20 cities throughout the U.S. This index, again, shows home prices year over year have increased about 4.3%. And, it's interesting that number because, again, we keep talking about how home prices are elevated, affordability is challenged, mortgage rates have been elevated. Wouldn't that cause home prices to not only stabilize, but maybe fall. Again, more evidence that simply is not happening. A 4% increase in appreciation year over year is a pretty good number. In fact, it's interesting. Reverse mortgage disclosures typically use a 4% annual appreciation rate in their assumptions to evaluate if a reverse mortgage is a good product for a senior homeowner. So no surprise there. Consider if you buy a $600,000 home and you see a 4% appreciation rate year over year, what does that mean? Well, at the end of the first year, it's 624. And you add that up over several years, and pretty soon you start to see that wealth building effect of even a 4% average appreciation rate. Of course, I already commented on the Fed's announcement that they're not going to lower the Fed funds rate anytime soon. I think on last week's show, I mentioned the Fed funds future market is now betting on a 50% chance of a reduction in the Fed funds rate, but only a 0.25%, and not until May. So then the other thing that actually came out today that's not on this chart, on this slide, is GDP did come out slightly lower than the previous quarter. For the fourth quarter, 2.3%. So not a bad number, but a little bit down from the previous quarter, couple quarters actually. So what's interesting, the economy is stronger, and yet we have a little bit of a drop in the GDP in the fourth quarter. And then the other thing is pending home sales. Of course, this is existing home sales. In December, they dropped after 4 months of increasing. Pending home sales dropped 5.5% in December. And what that illustrates, I think, is what I've been saying lately. It's now time, I think, for people on the fence, people kind of waiting for lower rates or lower home prices to buy a home. I think there's an opportunity there. The data suggests that. And of course, if home prices are still going up 4% a year, but you're seeing pending home sales drop by 5% in 1 month, that should be a signal to you prospective home buyers that have been on the sideline to start going out there, looking around. You have, I think, more negotiating power with the seller to extract some incentives like seller credits to help you with that loan package that you need to buy the home, help you get some better rates, whether it's a permanently bought down rate or using a temporary 2-1 or 3-2-1 buy down. So the last thing I'll say about the mortgage rate market as well as the bond market, look at the core PCE tomorrow, Personal Consumption Expenditures Index. That's the Fed's favorite inflation number. The forecast is for that to be flat at 2.8%. If that comes to be true, I think that'll be generally beneficial for bond yields, and maybe we'll see a little bit improving trend in the mortgage market, in mortgage rates. So that's what I've got for this week in terms of what's going on in the market as it relates to mortgage rates. So we're going to bring Jeff in so he and I can discuss some timely news in the markets for both, again, rates and the bond market.
Hey, Art, how are you today?
Hey, good. How are you?
Good. Hey, I just want to back up here for just a second because I want to ask you about the whole idea of the newly built homes and the incentives and the inventories are up, and also how much of this is there anything tied to the severe weather we've been having that maybe people aren't going out and shopping, or do you think they're just on the sidelines, kind of in this this wait and see moment?
Well, that's kind of a mixed bag there because, weather related issues that might affect home sales. It depends on where in the country we're talking about. I know there's been a fair amount of news, over the last month or so, a couple months maybe about, the winter weather, back east maybe being a little bit more severe than even what is normally expected. Whereas, certainly out here in the Western U.S., I know certainly in California, we seem to be back more in almost a drought situation. We've had very little rain and even snow. And in terms of the number of new home sales or the number of new homes on the market for sale having gotten more elevated, a good portion of that is actually in the Western U.S., where I would argue weather in and of itself has not been a major factor. So I think there's been other stuff going on. Again, remember that it was only, what's it been now, about 4.5, going on 5 months ago, we had conforming mortgage rates were in the 5s. And so as we entered going into the end of the year, suddenly that 10-year bond that was at 360 in September was approaching 5% in late December. And, obviously mortgage rates followed suit. So I think that probably had more to do with it as to the increase in new home inventory, those rates getting back up. The market is pretty sensitive and reacts pretty quickly to these changes in mortgage rates. So if you go from 5.5 in September to almost 7 in December, that starts to have a pretty good impact on that monthly payment. And I think that's probably what's going on with these builders, and the fact that they are seeing more inventory sitting, and that's why they're taking action and upping their incentives to get that inventory moved.
Well, on the bottom here, it says, on a financial markets, they respond with reptilian-like minds to stimuli on rates higher for longer. But when you're talking about home builders, I mean, they waste no time jumping on it saying, hey, we need to keep moving this inventory because we got to keep turning the money. And that should be a clue, shouldn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, again, a home builder is a little bit different than that, private individual trying to sell their individual home. But because with home builders, I mean, oftentimes, they're gonna sell homes in phases, and they may have an 8, 10, 12 home phase, and they'll start building. And of course, as they're building them, they're trying to sell them and get those contracts signed, and then those buyers are waiting for completion to actually close. Well, what can happen sometimes, depending on market conditions, like we saw, in terms of the change in bond yields and mortgage rates from September to the end of the year, they got those homes under construction, and then suddenly the sales rate, number of sale contracts that they're getting executed slows down, but yet those homes are getting closer and closer to completion. And next thing you know, you got standing inventory. And then that standing inventory, there's some significant carrying costs. If you're carrying 8, 10, 12, maybe 15 homes in a phase, and so they've got to react quickly. The CFO with that home builder is going to be knocking on the door of the president and say, hey, we got to move this inventory. We got to sharpen our pencil. We got to maybe adjust the prices. We may need to do some things on the incentive side to these home buyers and entice them to still buy and not worry about the fact that the mortgage rate went from 5.5 to 7. And again, builders are very good at doing that. In the existing home market, it's a harder message to get across to them. At that economic presentation we mentioned last week by the car economist Jordan Levine, I was sitting at a table with some realtors who commented about, a couple of them were taking new listings, and they were, kind of, just moaning about the fact that these sellers were just not dealing with the current market and telling them to list these homes much higher than the realtor was advising. And so they were just really grumbling about that, and the fact that a lot of these sellers still don't get it. And I think that's a message we got to continually get out there, that these sellers, just like home builders, need to react to current market conditions and give these prospective buyers what they want. They want better rates than what they're seeing, and there's a way to do that.
Yeah, I like that. Hey, I want to bring up the next thing that we've had. The most commonly asked question of the week is around this week's Federal Reserve interest rates. And I'm going to pull up a little, just kind of some headlines, and I'd like you to help comment on these. And if we look at this, it says, Powell says Fed doesn't need to be in a hurry to lower rates. What's the thought behind that?
Well, there's two, I would say, very basic fundamental reasons for Chairman Powell to say that. And it's what we just touched on, at least part of it. The labor market, the economy is doing pretty well. It's still pretty strong. And normally what you don't want to do is necessarily lower rates in a relatively strong economy. In fact, the Fed, I think, basically is a little bit concerned that if the economy is roaring along pretty well, if they lower rates too much too fast, that could actually be inflationary. And as it is, the Fed has gotten much closer to their target, which I'll remind everybody on the program, it's 2% inflation rate is what they're trying to get to. They've made a lot of progress, good progress, got it down from over 9 where we were, after 2021 and so forth. But we haven't gotten to 2. We've been kind of stuck right around, got a little bit under 2 at one point, but it's been kind of hovering around 3+. And in fact, for the last few months, there's been a couple of periods where it was kind of trending up above 3.1, 3.2. So when the Fed's looking at the fact, well, we haven't reached our target, and we haven't reached our target while the economy is continuing to roar along pretty well, that's a time where they're saying we're going to pause and kind of just keep an eye on this. We need to see more evidence that maybe the labor market's softening up. We need to see more evidence with the future inflation numbers over the next 2 or 3 months. Are we getting closer to that 2% target? And if we're not, they're going to probably stay in a pause position for an extended period of time. And that is why on Wednesday, when this was announced, the stock market initially sold off. The bond market initially jumped out of concern that maybe there's no Fed rate cuts coming anytime soon. And then again, what does that mean? As we've been saying, rates higher for longer. I think we're going to be in the 6+ range probably all of this year, and maybe even a part of 26. And maybe after that, we could hopefully get lower 6s into the 5s. The point of all that being higher for longer, I think, is the new normal.
Well, I look at this information and it makes such good sense. It's like, hey, if I am selling my wares in a market that is very, very strong, the last thing I'm going to do, especially when I have a monopoly on it, I'm not going to lower my prices. It makes no sense. But that's not really the process here, because it's not like the rates are a commodity. They're a product. It's really one of the economic levers, if you will. But it feels like it's still kind of that way. And with that, the second part of the question is, you mentioned about the softening of existing sales and the inventory build of new home sales. How does that start to impact this whole inflationary process? And does it put more pressure on the chairman to say, hey, we need to go back and rethink this?
Well, it can. I mean, ultimately, when it comes to inflation, of course, what are a couple of the major components of the inflation number? Well, it's food and energy, but it's also housing. And to the extent we start to see a case where the inventory of new homes has increased, there's more of them that are finished, standing inventory, as we call it. If there's a decrease in existing home sales, eventually there's going to be some price adjustments in those new homes, as well as the existing home inventory of homes for sale. And so there could be eventually some adjustment in those price levels, whether it's outright price reductions or indirect price reductions by offering incentives to the buyers to give them better financing terms. That could eventually trickle into some improved inflation numbers. But it's too early for the Fed to just assume that that's happening in real time, to the point that they're going to say, okay, let's lower the Fed funds rate another quarter this month and do it again next month. They're taking a more cautious approach to see if what we're seeing in December for both new home sale inventory as well as existing home sales dropping, is that an indication of maybe a trend that's going to continue for a longer period of time. Until they see that, I think they're going to stay kind of where they're at and not make any adjustments. And again, particularly until we see those inflation numbers, the PCE tomorrow, and then in February when we see the CPI and the PPI again, see where they come out. Are they making any more progress on inflation? If we don't see those data points showing that, I think they're going to pause even longer. Like I said, the Fed funds futures market is betting now we won't see a reduction in the Fed funds rate until May. So we've got 3 to 4 months to go, perhaps, before we see any more action by the Fed.
Well, I'm just curious if I'm gonna say real estate agents are moving with reptilian like when it comes to using temporary rate buy downs. But could personal homeowners who are thinking, I want to sell my home, or that it's been on the market for, let's say, higher than the average days on the market, could they take a page out of the home builder's book and say, hey, we want you to advertise our home in a way that says, qualify for loans as low as 3.5%. I'm just using your buy down example on your first page, right, starting at 3.5%. Could they start doing those kind of things as a buyer says, hey, listen, you want to sell my home. I don't want to lower the price. I want to give the buyer really what they want.
Right. I mean, that's the message I'm trying to get out to both realtors and their sellers. And, and that can be approached one of two ways, trying to educate the realtors who have those listings and educate their sellers that, hey, look, we've been on MLS now for 54 days. We haven't gotten any offers. And of course, what that triggers usually is a conversation between the listing agent and the seller about, well, I guess we better look at lowering the price. And that's been the age-old, simple, very straightforward strategy to try to generate some interest in getting some offers. The price is too high, we've got to lower it. And fundamentally, that's not, I guess, a bad idea, but I think it requires a little bit more creative thinking. Price reductions can take many forms. Why not offer a price reduction, but in the form of not an outright lowering of the price, but in the form of being willing to give a prospective buyer a certain percentage of the purchase price so that the buyer can use that to basically change their financing terms and subsidize their interest rate for 2 to 3 years. That's a much better financial outcome for the buyer, and it frankly addresses their major primary concern. They want lower mortgage rates. If you can start off on a $600,000 home and the current rate is 6.5, we'll determine if you can qualify for 6.5, because you do have to qualify for that rate. But if you can negotiate with that seller, hey, look, I think your home's overpriced, but I'm not asking you to lower your price. I'm asking you for X amount of dollars, which again on a 3-2-1 buy down is going to be about 4.5% of your loan amount, not the price. So if you're putting 20 or 30% down, that's actually less percentage to the seller on their price. I'm going to ask you for that concession, and then I'm going to use that so I'm not paying 6.5 the first year. I'm paying 3.5. I'm going to save $1,000 a month that first year. That's going to make me more willing to buy your home. I'm still getting that price reduction, but I'm getting it in dollars to apply to my financing, so I'm benefiting that way, and it's a much more significant benefit to that buyer than just what the monthly payment would be from a $25,000 or $30,000 price reduction. So it becomes the dynamic of, do we get that message out to the realtors, the listing agents, who then are going to educate their seller, or I'm trying even to consider, how do I get the message out to the consumer, the seller of the home, and maybe they're going to push that message to their listing agent. Like, hey, I don't want to lower my price yet. How about I offer a 3-2-1 buy down? I want you to market my property, telling this prospective buyer you can get a first year rate in the 3s. Let's lower our price that way, because it's more directly addressing the buyer's primary concern: lower rate, lower payment.
Seems like the smart play. Hey, Art, we're going to take just a slight break here. We're going to give a little thank you to our sponsor, and then we'll be right back.
We'll get right back to today's program. But first, I want to share something that could be incredibly valuable for senior homeowners. If you're over 65, own your home outright, or have at least 50% equity, you might be sitting on a powerful retirement tool, a reverse mortgage. But how do you know if it's the right move for you? That's where our free Senior Homeowner's Guide to Financial Freedom comes in. In just a few quick questions, you'll find out if a reverse mortgage could help you unlock the equity in your home to boost your retirement income. Click the link in the description to take the free assessment today. It's fast, easy, and could be the first step to a more secure retirement. Now, let's get back to the show.
Yeah, I just, one of the things that I really also want to bring up is this next slide, which to me is like, there's always this pressure of interest rates. But I found this today and I thought, oh my gosh, this is really, I think, significant, because it may not be so much about the interest rates, but yet it is. And this is why I said, if the sellers took that reign, could it change? And this is a U.S. Fed funds target rate. Now, the first little red circle here on the left is what it was in July of 2000. You can see it's above 6%, and where it is right now. So
Right.
if we just went on that, and I know that the federal funds rate is not the piece that drives the home loan rates, but if we look at that, Art, we're really in a better situation today than we were 20 years ago.
Well, that's exactly right. And of course, you're correct. I mean, as we keep, pounding this message, the Fed funds rate is not directly correlated to mortgages, but obviously it is a factor. But the Fed funds rate is entirely different. It's an overnight borrowing rate among member banks of the Federal Reserve System. But yet, overall, as this chart portrays, I think pretty well, it is an indicator of where rates, were back then and even are now. What's interesting about this chart is, back in 2001, it was the Fed fund target rate was higher than it is now. Now, anybody who's kind of got a handle on the history of mortgages and home prices will say, well, yeah, but it was okay at 6% back then because home prices were probably half what they are now, maybe a third of what they are now. So obviously that does make some sense. But then what we saw happen there is as they lowered the Fed funds rate, and got down pretty low into 2004, then of course things kind of got overheated. Inflation was becoming more of an issue. So as you can see there, then the Fed funds target rate started to get ramped up pretty quickly. And you see that pretty steep, trend back up, and it still got up just slightly above where we're at now, right around 2007, 2008. And of course, we all know what happened in 2008. We had the mortgage and real estate crash. And so what does the Fed do? They reacted to that, had to create liquidity, and they just, drove that target Fed funds rate almost to zero. And of course, that eventually did kind of get the economy and the markets to recover. But look how long it was just flat. I mean, we had essentially had almost a zero Fed funds target rate for many years, about 7, 8 years. And then, of course, things were getting a little heated again, so they ramped it up again. And then we hit the pandemic. And then they, again, after the pandemic, the Fed, just throws a huge amount of money into the economy to help us recover from essentially shutting down the economy. And then, we forgot. We pour that much money in the economy, and what happens? Inflation rate explodes. And so that's what led to that big, steep, upward trend back up in 22. And so, that's kind of got us where we're at now. We've got this inflation that got way out of control. Now we're trying to get it under control. They're making some progress, but they're not quite there yet.
Art, do you recall back in the first part of this chart where it explodes up, or even where it was when it started back in July of 2000? Do you recall what kind of inflation we were dealing with back then in these peaks? Was that one of those driving factors that said, hey, the inflation's high, we have to do something, so we raise it to get it to a peak till it gets there?
Yeah. In 2004, I mean, inflation was getting a little bit elevated. And so, again, it's very similar to what we're seeing in 2022. I don't recall that it got as high as it did in 22, 23, but it was certainly higher than it was prior. And so that's, again, that's what the Fed tries to do is as an inflation rate gets out of their target range, they're going to start raising that Fed funds rate to get it back under control. But then, sometimes they overshoot it in either direction. And so that's, of course, what happened in 2020 into 2022. There was so much money poured into the economy to help recover from the economy being shut down from the pandemic. And of course, the amount of money that the previous administration threw out there in terms of spending to try to get the economy out from the bottom, it overshot. And the expectation that the inflation rate was going to stay under control with that much money pumped into the economy was, I think, faulty at best. And like, oops, we had an oops moment where suddenly we're at almost zero inflation, and next thing you know, it's at 9, and then they got to hurry up and do an about face. So that's what's kind of interesting about this chart when you look at it, is how the reactions both ways they seem a little bit pronounced because you'd like to see a little bit more of a softer, flatter curve there or chart where things aren't so up and down in extreme, uh, at extreme levels. And I think that's a good example of how this is all pretty inexact science, and sometimes the Fed just doesn't get it right.
Well, it reminds me of watching someone who's losing their balance. Their reaction is really quick to try to counter, and then they're having to try to find that other balance. I remember as a young person learning how to drive, and they talked about oversteer. If you were on ice and you're trying to oversteer, don't do that, because if you hit a dry spot, that's what really caused the accident. And
Right.
this looks like there's a lot of oversteering there that you talk about, because yeah, it would be nice if, hey, there was just a nice steady line around 3, but
Right.
it's jerking up and down like somebody in a cardiac arrest.
Well, and what's interesting, we talked earlier about, what are the sectors of the economy that's going to affect the inflation rate. Well, think about it. In 2004, what happened to home prices from 2004 to 2008? They were like this.
Yeah.
So no surprise that as that was occurring, the Fed's seeing that and going, "Oh, wait a minute, inflation, it's starting to creep up." And in part, home prices played probably a pretty major factor. And of course, it got to the point where the bubble burst, and suddenly home prices collapsed. And then the Fed's like, "Uh-oh, now we got to reverse course and slam it the other way and drive those Fed fund rate targets way down to recover from this, bursting balloon," which of course was inflation, and in particular inflation in home prices. I mean, there was talk. Well, you remember there were talk back then. I could remember, out here in the Coachella Valley, uh, anecdotal stories about, people from LA, Orange County, San Diego. They were hearing about, how much money you can make buying a home. They'd come out here for the weekend, be at a restaurant or bar talking about, "What are you here for?" "I'm out here to buy a home because, I'm hearing that their prices are going up so fast. So I'm out here to buy a home, and in 6 months I can, turn around and sell it and make a killing." Well,
Yeah.
that 2004 to 2008 upward trend in that Fed funds target rate is a clue. It underscores that kind of phenomenon that was going on at that time.
Yeah. Well, Art, I really appreciate this. Again, this reminds me of that situation where, hey, we have the resources. It's just, are you resourceful? And meaning that, you have a home or you want to buy a home, and the resourcefulness is saying, just running at it and saying, I want a discount is maybe not the best way to do it. I'm not saying it's the only way. It is an alternative way, is to think about, hey, how can you get seller concession, lock in some lower rates on the 3-2-1 buy down or 2-1 buy down. And, I don't think, and this is an interesting part. Stop me if I'm oversimplifying this, but these peaks and valleys don't last forever. And if I see this right, as I'm looking at this second circle on the right, which direction is it heading? It looks like it's heading down.
Yeah.
Well, if we look at anything, we say, well, this looks a little bit like the 2008, even the July of 2000, it has something that's going to replicate itself. It's going to repeat itself. So I'm saying, if I were in a market, I'm going to do a temporary buy down, and I'm going to wait and watch that line go down, because we know that whatever happens, what follows it is lower home loan rates. Is that too simplified, Art, or is that pretty much on?
I don't think it's too simplified. Again, the Fed funds rate itself is not the direct indicator directly correlates. There's a kind of a lag period between as the Fed funds rate drops before it translates into the mortgage rate, because there's some basic principles in terms of what's the Fed funds rate, then what's the spread between a Fed funds rate and the 10-year Treasury bond yield, and then there's a kind of a standard spread or yield differential between the 10-year bond yield and a conforming 30-year mortgage. So indirectly, as the Fed funds rate drops, that typical spread between that and the 10-year bond yield, about 1% or so, is going to follow. So the 10-year bond yield will trickle down as well. And then that spread between the 10-year bond yield and a typical conforming mortgage rate, which generally can run around 1.5%, 1.75%, that's going to cause the mortgage rate to fall too. So they're all interconnected. the point I keep trying to tell people, it's not immediate. The Fed funds rate goes down a quarter or a half. You're not going to see that mortgage rate drop immediately by that same amount. It takes time. I think this current downward trend that you're referring to, where it's circled on the right, I think it's going to continue, but it's not going to be quite as sharp. It's not going to be a fall off the cliff type of a drop like you see in 2000 or 2008. I think it's going to be a little bit more gradual, which I think ultimately is healthier and probably better. But that underscores the fact that if you buy a home now, and you negotiate that concession, that price reduction, but in a more imaginative way of get that concession, buy down your rate for 2 or 3 years, I think that downward trend, that gradual trend, is going to set you up nicely as you approach the end of your buy down period to be able to refinance that note rate into a lower rate long term. And I think that's going to be a very good play for those who've got the imagination to go out and try to make it work. And we can help you with that.
I like it. Well, Art, thank you very much for peeling back the layers of this this onion and talking about it in depth as you have today. And I hope those people who are watching said, okay, I get a better idea of this. The sky is not falling. I don't have to be Humpty Dumpty. It can be put back together again. And there's some great opportunities out there, especially if you're, for existing home sales or new home sales. Play off of those new home sales people and say, hey, I can move I can use these tools to sell my individual home, even though I'm not a Toll Brothers or KB Homes or whoever the home builders are. So I think that's great. Well, Art, do me a favor, if you would, before we go, talk to us a little about what co-op and stock owners or a co-op is.
Yeah, good question, Jeff. Yeah, for our viewers, I wanted to touch on co-ops only because I had a recent inquiry about them, about a property like this. A co-op is a little bit unique, not very common, but they are out there. A co-op stock ownership situation is where you're going to buy a home, but the property, the home, is actually typically a unit in a building. And what you're doing is you're not buying the home outright where you're getting a mortgage secured by that home, by that unit. Instead, the building that unit is located in is typically owned by a corporation. And so what you're doing as a buyer of a co-op, what you're going to be doing is purchasing shares in that corporation, and the amount of your purchase price is going to depend on the size of the unit that you're purchasing. So you become a shareholder of this corporation that owns the building, and then you're given basically an agreement to occupy that unit. So you get all the benefits of home ownership, but rather than owning that unit outright as real estate, you're owning the shares in the corporation, who gives you benefits of occupying the home. So essentially that's what you're doing, is you're almost like renting a home. There's typically a lease payment, or otherwise you're making a monthly payment that's going to include things like the cost of property taxes, maintenance, and maybe the underlying mortgage if the corporation has the mortgage on the building. Now, a couple of things about the co-ops is they're more restrictive in terms of eligibility, because you're buying shares in this corporation. You do have to go through a process, essentially financial vetting, because you do have to be approved to be a shareholder in this corporation so that you can obtain one of these units to occupy. And so sometimes folks fail the financial vetting, and they're declined because the corporation doesn't feel like you have the ability to handle your ownership of the unit. Now, there's a belief that financing for these type of properties is rare, and in fact, frankly, it is. But I would want everybody to know that we do have the ability to finance a co-op stock ownership property. Now, there's not a lot of them out here. I did a search of co-ops on the MLS system, and just here in Southern California, there's about 80 properties, 80 units of stock cooperative ownership type properties. Now, most of them are in like Orange County, like Laguna Woods, Leisure World. These are very common in San Francisco, of course, back east in New York. We even have one here in the desert in Rancho Mirage. Although interesting with that one, the corporation does not allow a buyer of a unit in that building to get a loan to purchase. They require you to pay cash. That's a little bit unusual, but that can be an example of the kind of restrictions that could be placed on you if you want to buy a co-op stock ownership type property. And the reason you might consider this type of property is, generally speaking, they're going to be a little bit less price than you would, say, a typical condo. And the other thing about the financing that we can arrange is the financing is actually secured by the shares of stock that you own in the corporation for the unit you're going to be occupying. So a little different than recording a mortgage on the unit itself. The financing we have is 80% loan to value. It can be for primary or second homes. You have to have a credit score of 660 or higher. Again, 80% loan to value means you do have to have at least 20% down. Now, the rates are going to be higher than conforming rates. This falls into what we call the non-QM, the non-qualified mortgage basket. So you're going to be looking at rates that are going to be higher, typically around in the mid 7s up to about 8%. So the point is, we do have it available. So for anyone who's interested in anywhere in Southern California where you're looking at a co-op, feel free to contact me. I can provide you some specific numbers as to what the financing will look like. You don't necessarily have to pay cash unless that particular stock cooperative corporation requires that. Otherwise, if financing is allowed, we can help you. So with that, we're going to go ahead and end the program. I want to thank all of you for watching and listening to this week's Mortgage Minute. I want to wish you to have a very good weekend. Looking forward to see you next week. In the meantime, my name is Art Alvarez with Mortgage Works, where we have the answers and they're on the house. So long. Take care.